الجلسة اللي نحن بصدد البدء فيها هي تحت عنوان النمو الاحتوائي Inclusive Growth، كيفية الانتقال من تحديد الأهداف إلى تنفيذ الأهداف. وبالواقع موضوع النمو الاحتوائي مش موضوع جديد أو لم يتم البحث حوله من قبل العاديين، إنما الجديد فيه هو إنه موضوع أصبح وقته ملح، وأصبحت اليوم أهميته أكبر من أي وقت مضى، نظراً للتحديات اللي عم تمر فيها المنطقة، ونظراً للدور اللي ممكن يلعبوا موضوع النمو الاحتوائي إلى إعادة الأمل إلى الشباب العرب. صندوق النقد الدولي خلال المرحلة الماضية جهد للتفكير حول أهمية هذا الملف وكيفية التفكير بحلول عملية، حلول بتاخذ بعين الاعتبار ضرورة أن يكون أكثر من طرف مشارك، نظراً لأنه ورشة أو هدف النمو الاحتوائي يتطلب عدد كبير من المشاركين فيه، ابتداءً من الحكومات اللي هي بتلعب دور أساسي بموضوع وضع البرامج والسياسات، إنما ليست وحيدة. القطاع الخاص والقطاع المدني أو المجتمع المدني بيلعب دور أساسي، وبيلعب دور أيضاً مهم القطاع الفكري اللي هو بيساهم بوضع هالأفكار وهذه الحلول. وخلال السنوات الماضية بعد انطلاق المتغيرات بال 2011 صار في مجموعة من المحاولات بالصندوق لوضع الدراسات حول الملفات الأساسية اللي مرتبطة بموضوع التمويل الاحتوائي. وبعام 2014 صار في مؤتمر كبير بالمغرب بالأردن، تبعه مؤتمر صار بمطلع هذا العام بالمغرب، يلي كان هدف فيه الانتقال من وضع الخطوات أو السياسات إلى عملية التنفيذ. وفريق العمل بالصندوق اليوم انطلق بمجموعة من البرامج والدراسات لكيفية تطوير خطوات عملية بهذا المجال. واليوم مثل ما بتعرفوا نحن أطلقنا من بيروت التقرير يلي وضعه الصندوق عن موضوع النمو الاحتوائي. البعض بيسأل ليش الصندوق عم يطلع أو عم ينظر لهذه المواضيع اللي يمكن جديدة أو العالم ما كانت متوقعة إنه الصندوق يكون عم يطرح ملفات. بالواقع هو بالعكس، الصندوق يعنى بالاستقرار الماكرو اقتصادي، وكل ما له تأثير على الوضع الماكرو اقتصادي هو مهم بالنسبة لصندوق النقد الدولي. هيدا واحد. اثنين، لا يمكن بناء استقرار مستدام إذا ما كان هناك في شعور عند المواطنين إنه الوضع الاقتصادي أو النمو الاقتصادي هن مشاركين فيه ويستفيدوا منه. هيدا واحد. وأن يكون هناك جزء من السياسات اللي بتاخذ بعين الاعتبار الأوضاع أو التشوهات الموجودة وبتعالجها. من هون نحن بنعتبر إنه مسؤوليتنا ودورنا إنه ننظر لهذه الأمور ونشوف شو الحصة يلي مطلوب من الصندوق المشاركة فيها. ولهيدا الغرض رح أطلب من زميلتي كاتريونا بيرفيلد اللي هي زميلي معي بالصندوق، وأشرفت مع مجموعة من الاقتصاديين لوضع الأجندة يلي نحن اشتغلنا عليها بعملية تحضير المؤتمر، ويلي من خلالها أطلقنا مجموعة من الدراسات اللي اليوم التقرير هو جزء منها، وهي مسؤولة عن الفريق اللي بيجمع كل الأفكار بالديبارتمنت حول موضوع النمو الاحتوائي. ورح تحكينا شوي أكثر عن أولاً شو الأفكار اللي وصلنا لها بهذا المجال، شو التحديات اللي نحن نشوفها بالمرحلة المقبلة، وشو الخطوات اللي ممكن مجتمعين، حكومات، قطاع خاص، قطاع مدني ومؤسسات دولية بنقدر نكون فيها. بعد المداخلة لكاتريونا رح يكون في للبانل الموجود اللي هو من أرفع مستوى فكري بالعالم العربي بهالمواضيع. ابتداء من السيدات مها يحيى اللي هي مديرة معهد كارنيجي بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط ومركزها بيروت، وهي يمكن من أكثر الأشخاص وبأكثر من موقع شاركت وساهمت بالتفكير حول المواضيع الاقتصادية الاجتماعية السياسية في المنطقة. وكمان نتشرف بوجود شخصيتين مميزتين أصدقاء، دكتور ناصر سعيدي اللي الكل بيعرفه، وزير سابق نائب حاكم مصرف مركزي، منجم أفكار، وعلى طول بالصدارة بعملية طرح الأفكار الريادية الجديدة، بالإضافة إلى صديق وزميل سابق اللي هو كمان كان ببيروت وكان بكارنيجي، إبراهيم سيفي اللي هو وزير سابق بالأردن، ومن الأفكار والمتنورين بالعالم العربي حول المواضيع اللي لها علاقة بالإصلاح، وحول المواضيع اللي لها علاقة بكيفية التكييف بين الإصلاح المجدي الذي يأخذ بعين الاعتبار إذا بدي أقول الأوضاع والتطورات بالمنطقة. رح أطلب من كات تعمل مداخلة سريعة، وبعدين نفتح المجال للحوار، مجموعة من الأسئلة للمشاركين للتعقيب على التقرير وعلى الأفكار، ونطرح بعدين نفتح المجال للأسئلة والأجوبة. كات, the floor is yours.
Great, just trying to get the presentation.
And look here,
Yeah.
Perfect, it's there. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jihad for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity and honor to speak to the Arab Economic Forum today on the topic of inclusive growth. That is, growth that would benefit all people in the Middle East and North Africa. In the presentation today, I want to share with you why we at the IMF are putting inclusive growth at the heart of our policy dialogue with the Middle East. And I would like to expand on the policies we see as necessary to deliver this goal of inclusive growth, including by sharing with you some examples of the reforms that are already underway in the region. So why now? I don't need to remind all of you here that at a time when the world is growing old, MENA is very young. In fact, over 60% of its population is under the age of 30 years. Now that means in the next 5 years alone, some 27 million young people will come on the job market and seek work. But they're doing so at a time when growth in the region has slowed down significantly. The average rate of about 3.5% recorded in recent years is only half the rate of growth we'd seen in the previous decade, and it has not been enough to lift people's incomes, which in fact have only been rising by about 0.8% a year. And if you look at the graph, the blue bars in the emerging market economies in the Middle East, it in fact has been falling. On top of this low growth means that the youth are entering a job market where their peers that have gone before them are already facing record rates of unemployment. The rate of youth unemployment in the Middle East and North Africa is the highest in the world, at an average rate of 24%. But as with all averages, this hides the extent of the true challenge. In 8 countries in the Middle East, in Lebanon here, in Egypt, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Libya, and West Bank, Gaza, or Palestine, unemployment ranges above from 30% or more and actually peaks at 45% for the youth. And that rate doesn't capture the true extent of joblessness. Many youths have given up looking for work. They're not in education and they're not in training, and that's another 30% of the young population. Now, one reason why we see a high level of joblessness in the region is, in fact, it's an issue of gender. Women are not working. Even though women in the region are more educated often than their male peers, what we see is, on average in the Middle East and North Africa, only 1 in 4 of them work. In other emerging markets, it's more typical that 1 in 2 would work. And if you look at unemployment amongst young women, in some countries it reaches as high as 60%. That's in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Now, why are jobs not being created? We turn to some World Bank data that has been collected at the enterprise or firm level across 7 different countries in the region to try to understand better what's going on. And the first fact that we glean from this data is the fact that there's very few new firms being created in the region. If you look at this chart here, you see that per 1,000 people who are working of working age, only less than one new firm is being registered per year. That's 5 times less than what we see in other emerging markets in countries like Bulgaria, Chile, or Croatia. The pace of new firms being created is far higher. The second fact we see from this data is that firms generally in the region stay small. They don't grow into the M of medium, and they rarely grow to be large. Right here in Lebanon, the data shows us that over 40% of the firms here who are formal employ less than 10 people. Another 23% employ less than 20 people. In other words, over 60% of the firms here in this country are small. And when we look across the region here in this graph, you see that firms that are employing 20 people or less are actually shedding jobs at the moment rather than creating them. And even the medium-sized firms on the right who are creating jobs are doing so at a pace far slower than we see in sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, or Central Europe. But there was something interesting in this firm-level data that we'd like to point out, and these are what are called gazelles. So it's something very promising. These are firms that are small. They start with less than 5 employees, but over a period of 3 years, they double their number of employment. And these firms, even though they account for only 3% of the firms across these 7 countries, they created 3/4 of the net jobs in these firms, the net new jobs. They started small, less than 5 employees, remember, but they did things like harness technology, they innovated in their product lines, and they exported. And this allowed them to grow quickly and to create jobs. So answering the question why firms don't grow and why they don't hire brings us to the issue of policy. What should policymakers in the region be doing now to turn the situation around? Well, as Jihad mentioned, we had a conference earlier this year in Marrakesh where we brought together representatives of the private sector, the public sector, and civil society from 22 countries to discuss a range of priorities that are summarized here in a call to action called Act Now, actions that are needed to spur growth higher and to make it more inclusive. The ACT, the ACNT, are policies that are needed to lift growth higher. These are policies that will enable the private sector firms to become the engines for growth in the region. The ACT focuses on policies, the A, on policies to address corruption, the C, on policies to create a business environment so that all firms, big and small, can compete on a level playing field, and the T is the ability to leverage trade and technology to allow firms to grow bigger, tap larger markets, and ultimately hire more people. The Now, however, focuses more on what governments can do with their budgets, not only to protect the poor, but also to ensure that people have the best opportunities possible to participate and benefit in growth and find jobs. Now let's go through each of these. The ACT, the A, points to the need for policies we've heard a lot about this morning to control corruption and strengthen regulation. And indeed, the region is far more burdened by corruption than any other region in the world. 55% of firms here in the Middle East report that corruption is the biggest constraint they face to business. We also see it in other ways in the regulatory environment, where we see on the World Bank's governance scores indicators have deteriorated across the board since 2010 in areas such as government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and of course control of corruption. Corruption is a tax on growth and incomes. Our research at the IMF finds that countries who slip in these rankings, say from the 50th half mark in percentile on the scores down to the 25th percentile, sees real per capita incomes fall. They're on average about 0.7 to 2 percentage points lower than the countries that are scoring around half on the index. They receive less investment. Investment is on average 1.7 percentage points lower. They collect less in tax revenues, about almost 1% of GDP lower than countries who are doing better in controlling corruption. So what can countries do about it? Let's turn to the example of Tunisia. Tunisia is a country where 36% of firms say corruption is the biggest constraint to their business. In 2013 alone, $230 million were paid in bribes to officials. Last year, Tunisia adopted a new anti-corruption law that established the highest authority for good governance. It's an independent body that oversees all policies related to corruption. The law created rewards for those who identify corruption. It criminalized anybody who wanted to retaliate against the whistleblowers on corruption. It improved access to information for CSOs and the press, and it established a legal framework for financial courts. Going forward at the IMF, our member countries have asked us to focus more on corruption, as well as measures to improve regulations and institutions so to take away the opportunity for corruption going forward. The second policy we see as necessary to lifting inclusive growth in the region is summarized as the need for competition. This boils down to the need for a better business environment and greater access to finance. Indeed, when we look at the data, we see 21% of firms in the region saying lack of access to finance is a huge obstacle to their business. And as borne out in the data, only 70% of adults in the region have bank accounts. And importantly, bank lending to the SME firms, these small firms we talked about earlier, only amounts to 2% of GDP. This is the lowest of any region in the world. If the region could implement reforms to close the gap in financial inclusion for SMEs and bring that level of finance towards the middle of that graph, growth in the region could be 2.5 percentage points higher over the medium term. We already see a lot of firms in our countries in the region turning to fintech to try to address this constraint. Jihad mentioned already the 7-fold increase in fintech firms in the region being led by countries like Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan. And we see some of these earlier firms like Fari in Egypt moving away from being just simple e-payment service platforms into finance platforms for these SMEs, so it holds a lot of promise. We also see that access to finance can also spur inclusion. In Morocco, there was this wonderful example of people who tapped finance through a microfinance institution called Al-Iktissad. These people who found finance through this institution were able to increase working outside the home. They increased the hours worked outside the home by some 52%. That meant their incomes, savings, and consumption were 10 percentage points higher than they were before they had access to this finance. So it could be a real enabler to inclusive growth. Now, the T talks to the reasons why many firms in the region stay small, and it's the lack of market access. Fadi Handour, who spoke in Marrakesh this year, put it very eloquently. He said the region is made up of 22 countries. That means 22 different customs codes, 22 different regulators, and 22 different standards. And local markets are often just too small for firms to achieve the scale necessary to improve efficiency and productivity and to grow. And our data shows that indeed the region we heard this morning is very close to trade, not only in goods, but importantly also in services. And the region is not very integrated into global value chains. If the region could open up more to trade, it could be a huge enabler. If we took the best improvement in trade openness we've seen in the last decade in the region, in the UAE, and other countries mimic that openness, the region could be growing by another 1 percentage point higher over a 5-year period. If openness to trade was combined with efforts to diversify the range of export products exported, the quality of them, and to improve participation in global value chains, over a 10-year period, per capita incomes could be 5 percentage points higher. There is already a country doing a lot of this in the region, and it was Morocco. They established the Casablanca and Tangier free trade zones to attract FDI and to integrate Morocco into the global value chain for automotives. And that was done to reduce the reliance on agriculture and real estate as a driver for growth. How did the country do this and grow these zones to be employers of some 85,000 people and exports worth 2.8 billion? How did they do it? Well, the government led the way by facilitating the cluster. First of all, it freed the firms who were working in these clusters from controls on FX, foreign exchange, from regulations that govern their activities in industry and commercial sectors. It invested heavily in roads and ports. And to overcome the skills gap that they saw, they didn't have a lot of workers with those skills. They worked with the private sector to create institutions or institutes that trained the workforce in the skills needed, and they offered subsidies. And these institutes, in turn, helped disseminate the best practice to the local suppliers, so that now almost 43% of the car parts produced in this zone are now sourced from local firms. Now, the Act, the ACNT we've talked about now, focus very much on the private sector. But fiscal policy, government budgets, remains one of the most important tools available to governments, both to spur growth and to achieve their distribution objectives. But as mentioned earlier this morning, we know that the region, not just Lebanon, but elsewhere in the region, are facing high levels of fiscal deficits and debt, and the public sector can no longer be the driver of growth. It has to change its role to be a facilitator of growth. And how can they do this? Well, first of all, if we look at the spending on social safety nets and other inclusive growth priorities such as education and health, we see that it only amounts to about 11% of GDP in the region. This is far less than what the region spends on wages and salaries, interest and subsidies. Wages and salaries, for example, on average, account for 11% of GDP in the region. So this high level of spending we see on wages and salaries, on subsidies, is crowding out the space for spending on inclusive growth priorities. If we take the example of just fuel subsidies alone, the region accounts for about a fourth of global spending on fuel subsidies. That's $74 billion US. That spending is mainly going to the better off in society. The top 20% of the income distribution are getting 43% of the benefits of that spending. Why? Because they drive the cars and use the fuel. If governments could take some of that spending from fuel subsidies and use it in a different way, what could happen? To give an example we have here, we said, well, imagine if you could just redirect 1 percentage point of that spending into infrastructure. Do that each year for 6 years, growth could be far higher at 2 percentage points. Or, if you eliminated fuel subsidies and used the money to create targeted cash transfers, you could raise your spending on social safety nets from 5% of GDP to 7%. Countries in the region are already doing this. Look at Egypt. It has a multi-year plan to phase out its fuel subsidies and to replace them with more targeted cash transfers. And because of this reform, it's been able to improve access to its cash transfer programs, TAFU and CAMRA. Today, instead of 160,000 families accessing these programs, now there are about 1.7 million families accessing these programs. That's about 8 million people that are now benefiting from targeted cash transfers in Egypt. But I do acknowledge it takes time to reprioritize spending and to change it. In the meantime, governments could be doing more to raise revenue in an equitable and fair manner to fund inclusive growth priorities. The region as a whole only collects 9% of GDP each year from taxes. That's not enough even to cover the wage bill. And we're not necessarily talking about increasing tax rates here. We see tax collections in the region are being eroded by excessive exemptions, tax evasion, and weak tax administration. This benefits the big firms, the multinationals, and is contributing to the high regulatory burden and that uneven playing field we talked about for the small firms. There's also scope to increase the progressivity of income taxes in the region. The rich are paying less than the poor in taxes. Why? Top tax rates in the region are relatively low. The tax rates kick in at relatively low income levels, and on top of it, the rich earn most of their income from property, interest, and dividends, and most tax systems don't even tax that income. In Bahrain, we try to use data that we found in the household survey data to try to show the payoffs to inclusiveness from pursuing a more progressive income tax in Bahrain. If you step back for a moment, we see that Bahrain only collects about 4% of GDP in taxes. Its wage spending is 12% of GDP. Its subsidy spending is 8% of GDP. if it were to introduce a progressive income tax, if it was a flat rate tax, our data showed us it didn't make much of a difference to the Gini of income inequality. It stayed roughly similar at 31%. If the tax was made progressive, in other words, if the low income earners had a tax subsidy or credit, and there was a flat capital gains tax introduced, the Gini would drop to 29%. If that was combined, that progressive income tax was combined with a reform to the energy subsidies, the Gini would improve even further to 27%. So it shows you the power of household survey data to illustrate the benefits to inclusiveness of government policies and to introduce progressive taxes in a fair way. But it's also not just about taxation and spending more. It's about doing better with the money that you spend. Within the region, we see that some countries are spending a lot on education and health. We have some examples here, but the outturns that they see in terms of results and test scores or life expectancy is unfortunately not as high as some other countries who spend far less. Here on this graph, you see in the red dots the examples of Saudi Arabia out to the right, or Kuwait, that are spending about 7 or 8% of GDP on education, but the test scores is far weaker than the countries such as Turkey, Japan, who are spending only about half that amount. There's also still a lot of gaps in access to education and services, health services, particularly in rural areas. And if the region could eliminate those gaps, there could be a substantial improvement both in educational scores and also in health expectancy. The final priorities for governments to work on is education policy. The need for better education and skills training is essential to address the problem of youth joblessness. But here I come back to the issue of women. It also requires special dedicated policies to help these women find work in the the labor market. Jihad mentioned earlier that if the gap between men and women's participation in the labor market was reduced to half the level that we see in other countries in the EM region. Currently it's 3 times higher, and we say let's just reduce it to being 2 times higher. The region could have seen GDP that would have been $1 trillion higher than it is today. What policies could help do that? Well, again, we used household survey data from the region in one large oil exporter country to look at what policies could make a big difference to this. The biggest change could be just addressing the wage gap between men and women. In this country, we found that the wage gap currently was about 40%. In other words, take the skills of women and men, even accounting for that and their experience, there was still a 40% wage gap. If you could even just half that gap, GDP in this particular country would be 26% higher, and with it, government taxes could rise from 15 to 18% of GDP. We also looked at issues of childcare and found that actually introducing subsidised childcare for low-income women could actually pay for itself because women, more skilled women would work as a result of it. This would raise the tax base and the programme would pay for itself. And the final issue, of course, that was raised this morning, which is very particular to this region, is the burden that it's carrying for refugees. It hosts the largest amounts of people displaced in the world from conflict and internally displaced people as a result of conflict. Policies are needed to address the pressures on public services and labour markets that arise to the host countries. Here in Lebanon alone, we see that about 1/3 of the education system registrants are refugees. And we basically need policies to integrate refugees more into the education and labour markets of the host countries through training, counselling and work permits. So let me finish here by just concluding that the Act now is basically a call for policymakers in the region to embark urgently on a comprehensive set of reforms to unleash the potential of the region's greatest asset, and that's its young people. Thank you.
For all who are interested in more details, the study is published today. There are hard copies outside, and also you can find electronic copies on our website. And not because the study is published that we stop working on this issue. At the contrary, Now we are working on financial inclusion, especially on access to finance to SMEs, as Kat showed in one of the slides. 3% of GDP is the total amount of lending to SMEs, which is far low compared to other emerging markets and compared to the potential of the financial sector. We're working too also on mainstreaming this agenda on country level by trying to integrate this work in the way we as a fund, we do our consultation and policy supports to country of the region. Therefore, this is a priority that is going to be a medium-term agenda for us, and we look forward to your comments as well as also we look forward to see others, in fact, embracing this agenda. This leads me to ask the panelists to have their first reaction, and I will start with Dr. Nasser Saidi. And I would like, in addition to your comments on the study, also to get your views as someone who is very much involved into technology, which we consider is one of the driving forces of transformation in the region, positive, of course, with some impact on the labor market, and this is something that we will study for the region, what will be the impact of technology on the future of work. I would like Dr. Saidi, in addition to your comments, tell us a bit on technology, financial inclusion, as well as also how you see the ability to create more bright spots in the region to move the needle in terms of creating more.
Thank you. Thank you. Are we live? Can we hear?
Yeah.
Meshi? Okay. First, let me thank you publicly. Let me thank the IMF publicly because over the years, you continuously come up with reports and analysis of the region, which is something that we're very poor. The only time in many cases in many countries where we get data on what's happening in the economy, finance, society, etc., is when the IMF does its Article 4 or other analyses. So thank you for this one. I just want to add a warning a little bit to what was said. You pointed out the high rates of unemployment, which are the highest in the world, and the highest for youth in particular, and even higher for women. And the labor force participation rate of women is much lower than it is in the rest of the world. So even when women do participate, they have very high unemployment rates, so 40 and 45%. And you point to the demographics, and the demographics are a sign of danger. Of course, they could be very positive, but you could be very negative. And I think the danger is that you've got a combination of high unemployment, low levels of education of many young people, without the ability to enter the labor market. So education for employment is something critical moving forward. And the reason why I want to raise that warning is that we've just been through a period of 7 or 8 years of turmoil in our region, where our young people got into all forms of extremism. If we continue with high unemployment rates of youth, high poverty level, and lack of inclusiveness of growth, then we're setting the stage for even more extremism in the future. So I think a central message that comes from this report is that inclusiveness is very necessary for both political and social stability. So let me mention, you asked me to comment a little bit on technology, and I will do so. And particularly when it comes to youth, SMEs, and even government. And let me again start with another warning. When I'm looking across the global landscape, the changes in technology that are happening are very rapid, and they're going to be pervasive. There are things like robotics, what we call the fourth industrial revolution, blockchain, artificial intelligence. All of those are going to mean that there's a big possibility that many people who don't have the talents and skills and knowledge might remain unemployed for very long periods of time. and that there will be labor-saving technologies which are being introduced across many sectors, manufacturing, industry, and the other. And I guess the danger that I see for the Arab world is that unless we innovate and modernize very quickly and enter what we call the fourth industrial revolution, then this problem of unemployment will become even larger and more widespread. And it covers all sectors, from agriculture to banking to services in general. So what is it on the horizon that we can do? Let's take fintech to begin with. And fintech, of course, is introducing new technologies. We mentioned AI, blockchain, distributed ledger technology. But it need not be limited to the financial sector, important as it is. One of the things that we need to do with fintech, of course, is to make financial services, banking services, widely available. And that means being able to operate and have access to finance through your mobile phones. This is what's happened, for example, in a number of countries such as Kenya. And we can do that in many countries. You take a country like Egypt, only 1 in 10 households has a bank account. If you don't have a bank account, you don't really have access to the rest of the economy. You cannot prove collateral, you cannot get financing, you cannot get loans. So the promise of fintech is that it can be introduced across the whole population. But also the same technology addresses one of the issues that you mentioned, mainly government. One of the major areas are the issue of corruption and waste. Introducing e-government, and we discussed that some 10, 15 years ago as a trend, should now be replaced by talking about mobile government. If I take a country like Dubai, 85%, or the UAE and Dubai, 85% of government services now in Dubai are delivered via a smartphone. The importance of that, of course, is that it's a major technology against corruption and waste. So introducing that and using technology in government, both for revenue collection as well as providing services, could be a major innovating factor. The other, of course, issue is, that was mentioned in the report, concerns access to finance, and particularly by SMEs. The facts speak for themselves. SMEs represent easily 80 to 85% of the companies that we have in the Arab world. They get less than 20% of the loans, and all of that is very small. There are issues in terms of the information and infrastructure. So, for example, credit bureaus would certainly help. But credit bureaus give you information, but they need to be expanded to the non-banking sector. Much of our reliance is on the banking sector. We have not developed our financial markets. We have not developed our non-bank financial intermediaries. So fintech also helps in this area because of possibilities of using crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, and the financial markets. So for the SMEs, I think that's part of it. But I think more interesting and more important for the SMEs is that we need to facilitate the entry of firms, but also their exit. And again, let me give you an example. We need to lower the cost of doing business. Many countries still have high levels of minimum capital that have to be put up. There is no good economic reason for having minimum capital. We can reduce that to zero and still have safety and soundness of the sector. Being able to establish quickly is something extremely important. In many countries, it takes a long period of time and months to establish yourself. Let me again use the example of UAE. Last week, they announced that you can establish a company in 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, okay? Assuming that you have all the documentation already prepared. And I guess all of this comes online. But allowing companies to be established is not the end of it. You also have to allow them to exit. And bankruptcy laws are extremely important. So one of the areas where we need to facilitate exit is by improving bankruptcy laws and also facilitating mergers and acquisitions. So if you want to help your SMEs, I think that's a major area to work on. Another structural change concerns accounting. You might be surprised by what I mean by accounting. But in many cases, when we impose accounting standards such as IFRS on small companies, they are unable to do so. It is too expensive and demands too much information. So one structural reform is to go for light IFRS, which is for SMEs. In addition to that, I think there's one other major area which has to do with the labor market. And again, this is having to do with SMEs, but particularly women. This is a major area of reform. Most of our laws only allow for full-time employment. What we need to do is to allow for part-time employment, flexible hours, so women in particular can work from the home, can work part-time. At the moment, you cannot do so. The same is true for internship and on-the-job training. These are very important because although we have the gazelles may not last. Many of them don't persist into the third and fourth year. They need training, and allowing them to get training in companies is an important way for them to get the skills so that they can run their businesses later on. And I think particularly for SMEs, they face two issues. And I live with them, I do a lot of, I'm very much involved into seed funding, crowdfunding, and the rest. And they face two major issues. One of the issues is that big companies, in particular state-owned enterprises and governments, discriminate against them because they don't have a history, they haven't proven themselves. What can you do about that? You need to change the procurement laws to give maybe a quota, a certain percentage for SMEs. Saudi Arabia, for example, has started to innovate in this by, say, having Aramco saying 20% of my procurement will come from SMEs. Dubai Expo 2020 has done the same thing. They said 20% of the procurement should come from SMEs. So let me just quickly end at this stage by saying there are a large number of reforms, laws and regulations that need to be changed, major investments in terms of technology, and that can really help both SMEs, women, but also address many of the issues that were mentioned in the report in terms of government and the reforms needed at the level of government.
Thank you, Dr. Saidi. Let me turn to Rahim. First of all, I will ask to accelerate the process of this. It's imposed on me. To ask you to give, but you are one of the few who lived, I'll say, both on both classes. As a minister, you experienced it on the ground, and also as an expert, as a thinker, you designed, you dreamt of it. I would like to ask you, in the presentation, we saw a lot of reforms that we all agree on, but we don't see them happening. We all know that those are the priorities. We hear many of the speakers and decision makers, in fact, discuss those things or present those things. How can we? Where are the 2-3 things that you recommend us to focus on in order to make a dent in this agenda?
Thank you. Thanks, Jihad, and thanks to Al-Iktissad working. Yes. Thanks for the Al-Iktissad and IMF to give us this opportunity opportunity to discuss what I think is a very timely report, actually. And I would second what Dr. Said said. We need such a comprehensive view for the region. Although we risk the aggregation of the countries sometimes, when you look at some of the indicators, we can discuss, especially when you took the tax burden and including sometimes the Gulf countries, etc. Just we have to be careful when we disaggregate numbers, but I think it's well known in the head of the team that has prepared this. And I didn't prepare actually to coordinate the answer with Jihad, but actually he asked the question that I would like to answer actually, which is basically what we agreed on these 5 areas that already presented and what needs to be done in terms of the business environment, the role of the private sector, fiscal policy, corruption, etc. But what we're lacking, I think, and what is growingly we're witnessing probably in the region, is something that we need. I hope that the further discussion will be somehow focused on such issues. The confidence between society/business community and governments on the other side actually is growing. Indeed, there is a kind of not only a gap, it's much more deeper. There is a rift now between what the government is saying and how the business community and how the people at large react to that. Indeed, that makes reform extremely difficult, even if it's beneficial in the medium to long term. However, this gap, this lack of confidence, which is consistently has been growing over the past probably 15 years in the region, I think has really thwarted many of the reforms attempts in the region, and I think this is somewhere where that focus needs to be done. Second, in the report, there was a mentioning of this number of newly established firms in the region vis-a-vis other regions, and it's much lower than what's happening. This is again, I think, relates to the incentive structure that exists, which I hope that also the discussion, incentive structure both economically and politically actually. Incentive structure in that there is this tendency to focus on short-term investment, not long-term investment. Incentive to avoid going deep into the sectors but trying to focus on rent-seeking activities. This is an area where I hope that also our discussions in the future will be focused on. The fiscal policies in the region, and that also relates to my first point on the lack of confidence. I would totally agree that we need to revisit this social spending, and we need to sort of get it into targeted, much more targeted and much more efficient. And it's quite telling when you look at how much we spend on education and what are the scores that in the international ratings. That tells you that there is something deeply wrong in this. This is not only corruption, this is waste. This is appeasement. This is all kind of socio-political factors comes into the spending, which we avoid sometimes addressing when we analyze this, but we cannot continue with this. Because if this continue, as the report mentioned, business as usual would not serve us. Now, we could save some of the social spending. But another area where also poorly, and the report did not, probably for all kinds of reasons, did not well into it, the defense and security spending. That is also takes a huge amount of our budget spending actually, and it goes unnoticed sometimes. This is like one of the taboos that nobody addresses, nobody talks about, but if we just compare as well in the report, how much we spend on military and spending vis-a-vis other regions, we would find that there is also a big sort of gap, and we are spending much more per capita or as a percentage of GDP, etc. And this is something that we need to look at. One very important issue that the report focuses on, and we happen to work with, I met Dr. Riyad today on competition in the MENA region. It's a very concentrated market that we have in the region. It's very few players who control very few players controlled like the largest share in the banking, in the manufacturing, in many sectors. Now, would we open a discussion and debate about how we can make this more competitive market as we wish, and as basically the orthodox and the new classical recipe that comes with that, we have to have more in that area. Would the business elite would allow you to open the market more? I actually, for the sake of time, I will not read, but there is a very good quote that I see in the report on access to finance, which is highly emphasized, which is very important. But who would allow you to access finance? If there is this bondage between banks and business on one side and the government on one side. Their focus on public sector is true. They're large, it's true. SMEs are denied access, it's true. But we have to dig into the roots why this is happening. Why SMEs are not accessing. Not only to say that they are not accessing, but why they are not accessing. It's not only because they're working in the informal sector. It's because actually this is a whole banking system, a whole financial system that is sort of anchored by collateral and not by the cash flow. And this is what also prevents this SMEs, which I put quote unquote because SMEs cannot be a driver for growth in the region unless there is this vertical integration between the large corporations and the small SMEs, similar to Korea, Japan, and other countries in that respect. Consistency in terms of also continuing and pursuing our policies as governments. This is something that also we lacking on the government side. That these policies keep changing whenever there is a new government, and we're blessed with governments. At least in my country, Jordan, we're sort of there. Now Egypt is following suit, and now Lebanon is pursuing or forming a new government. So sometimes we lose that consistency in terms of policies whenever there is a newcomer into the government. And that is actually would definitely hinder that. What the international community, the IMF and others can do about it, probably we have to agree on a kind of a vision, a framework similar to what is now pursuing in some of the countries. One final point, I have actually like 9 points, but I don't know how much time I have, but I can come to that. There is this assumption that governments have the capacity to undertake these reforms. Do our governments in the region possess the capacity to undertake some of these reforms? Do they have the skills to do it? Do they have the vision? Actually, I'm afraid that this is an area where a lot of capacity building needed. And I know that, I think in that we agree with the contents of the report that's something that needs to be done. I'll end it here with just one note that with this fourth industrial revolution, with this, and Dr. Saeed has alluded to that, artificial intelligence, the shape and the structure of the labor market is changing. I'm afraid that we still analyze our labor market dynamics with demand and supply similar to following a classical, traditional kind of analysis. I think there is a need now to relook because I don't know. I mean, this unemployment with this new technology comes together. Less people, more robots, more artificial intelligence would really pose more challenges to the region, which we need to really give some deep thought. I'll end my note here, but I think this is a very much needed debate, and thanks for producing such a good report.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think you touched on very interesting points, starting from trust and confidence. I think it's at the heart of any transformation. Without trust and confidence, it's very difficult to ask people to make additional efforts without really understanding how this is going to be invested. This leads me to ask Maha, you sit I would say at the crossroad. You see people from public sector, private sector, thinkers from different backgrounds. This inclusive growth agenda requires several stakeholders to work together and at least in a synchronized way. How, from your experience, from your knowledge about the region, you think is the good way to put governments, citizen or citizen representative together in order to lift this big agenda and do it in, I would say, in a sustainable way, not in one effort and then to recede or immediately shift views. I would like to have your views on that. Yes.
Some of my comments. This is much better. Yeah. No, Brahim preempted some of my comments already, but if you're talking about how to bring people around, let's just zoom out a little bit. I think what Brahim was saying and what others have been saying is that while a lot of the ideas, and we discussed this a few days ago, a lot of the ideas that are there are spot on and very badly needed, I think we need to zoom out a little bit and look at the region as it is today. Yemen is not Tunis, and it's not Saudi Arabia, and it's not Lebanon. So I think we need to look into what are the trends that are both global, but also what are the trends that are very particular to our region when it comes to not only economic growth, but also political growth and political development, because without politics, economies won't work either. I would say that the different stakeholders, obviously, each one has a distinct role to play, and a consistent dialogue is necessary. In Lebanon, we have something called the Socioeconomic Council, which is one area or one arena where such dialogue can be happening sustainably. In Tunis, there's another similar formation that includes labor unions as well, where such dialogues can persistently happen. But I think for this to actually be quite fruitful, we need to zoom out a little bit and look at what are the key trends beyond conflicts that are impacting the region. I agree with Brahim, automation is obviously one of them. And just to look globally, some of the global trends in technological development, if automation continues at its current pace, we will lose 15% of the current jobs worldwide, i.e. 400 million jobs will be lost worldwide in the next few years. And if it accelerates, then the rate would double. According to some reports, they indicate that some 57%, mainly blue-collar jobs, are at risk of being lost globally. Countries in this region will be impacted. This doesn't mean that automation, innovation, technology is something we should not be investing in, but we actually need to start looking at what are the additional measures and mechanisms that need to be put in place in order to mitigate the impact of automation. Social safety nets go along with reforms. These are important, but there are other measures that are being looked at, including universal basic income, for example. Is this something that we need to consider? And if it is something that we need to consider, then how are we going to finance it? And I think this brings me kind of to my second point, which is the entire policy framework within which we're supposed to be working. What are the trade-offs? What is the vision? Where do we want to be in 2030? What is the policy sequencing? It's good to say that we need to re-evaluate our safety nets, we need to remove subsidies because some of them are quite wasteful. However, the entire policy framework, policy space and fiscal space, understanding that one policy has an impact on the other is also necessary. And this is where a dialogue between all the stakeholders is quite important. What I see as government's role here, obviously, is one as regulation, a regulatory role, one that is able to level the playing field, One is that it is able to look at the second major trend that I think is affecting big parts of this region, which is conflict and the refugees. You allude to the refugees question in your presentation. Just to give one figure, 50% of the world's refugees come from this region. They come from our countries, 50%. Sorry?
60.
Saudi 60?
60.
As far as I know, it's 50%, maybe Saudi 60. In Syria alone, we're looking at 5 million refugees and another 6.7 million people internally displaced. We have similar stories in Yemen, in Iraq, in Libya, and so on and so forth. The knock-on effect is not only on the countries themselves, but on their neighboring countries and across the region. What this means is it's not just about humanitarian disasters and crises, but we're talking about the loss of skills, we're talking about a tremendous rollback in development, the figures in educational attainment are literally crashing. We have lost generations amongst Syrians and amongst Iraqis and amongst Yemenis today. There is a de-skilling of this population. This is a massive, if I look at Lebanon alone, 400,000 of the refugees in Lebanon, of the 1 million refugees, are youth. So if these kids don't have an education, they have no skills, are unable to enter the labor market and remain outside formal mechanisms, then they are ripe for exploitation down the road. And frankly, we will have no one to blame but ourselves. So we do need, and this is where the role of governments comes in, we do need to look at what are the mechanisms, not only at the national level, but at the regional level, with which we can address this. Because what happens in Lebanon today will not stay in Lebanon, but actually has ripple effects across the region. We are tightly interconnected, whether we like to admit it or not, in more ways than one. The other issue I would like to mention, which is again something that Brahim started with, and that's the issue of politically connected firms and the idea of the complicity within our systems across the board. I'll take Lebanon, for example. There's this recent study that came out by Ishaq Diwan and Jamal Haidar, I believe, that looked at the impact of politically connected firms in a country like Lebanon, and showed that politically connected firm, what runs the system in Lebanon is actually what they call as, it's not a trend, it's actually the art of the deal. And I'm not quoting President Trump here, but it is the art of the deal in Lebanon. And the politically connected firms are actually crowding out all other potential small medium enterprises, all kinds of innovation, because they have access and because they have privileged access to state institutions, to land, to resources, to tenders, bids, etc. In another country like Egypt, where the army has privileged access, and there are more and more indications and studies coming out that are showing the extent to which it's not just about direct ownership, but also using state resources, privileged access to land and other resources through which the army is capturing the economy and the state, or the military, if you want, complex. So I think these are serious issues we need to look at and ask to what extent international organizations are even able to make a dent in this if there is no national and regional willingness, the political will to address these issues if we really want to move towards more productive economies. Perhaps I'll just touch on two other issues. The one that is directly connected to this is that from this perspective, corruption is not simply a question of bad governance. It's not simply a question of rooting out the young man who is sitting at the border in Tunisia and taking bribes. And we saw actually an expansion in this. Some called it the democratization of corruption. It's not about that, but it's actually looking at the rot that is inherently within our systems. In Tunisia, prior to 2011, I believe it was a World Bank study that indicated that close to 32% of, the Ben Ali family had captured close to 32% of firms and other economic benefits in Tunisia. So we need to look at corruption as something that is far than putting in place automated systems that deal with petty bribery and so on and so forth. And finally, perhaps, and of course this comes with the understanding that the kind of competition we're seeing today is a losing game for all because our systems will not sustain it down the road. And maybe my final point here is to also talk a bit about the role of private sector and universities. Private sector can also obviously play a bigger role in facilitating employment for those for its own employees, but also in investing in employees. Very few of our firms invest in training, in reskilling of current employment force. But also in women. I cannot talk about investing in women. And just to talk about, to quote the Minister of Trade and Development, who 2 days ago was speaking about this issue at Carnegie, where she talked about investment in women not as the good thing to do, but as the smart thing to do. 50% of this region's population is women. Investing in their capacity and their employment potential is the smart thing to do if we really want to achieve economic growth. And this, the private sector, I believe, can play a significant role by providing the kind of addressing the legal obstacles to equal pay, but also to things that hinder women from entering the workforce, including childcare, amongst other things. And I know Jordan, under actually the man who became the current Prime Minister, but at the time that he was at the head of the Social Security, was actually working on some of these issues and some of the obstacles that hinder women from entering the workforce. And finally, universities, I think, can also play a much more important role than they are playing right now. Right now, we have most of our universities across the region are just graduating individuals with very little concern for or very little attempt to link with labor market demand. We just have massive numbers of people that are coming out. But I think also universities can play a much more important role through an their intermediary position at the cusp between research, innovation, and the marketplace out there. So I think we need to also look at what role universities can play, much more constructive role that universities can play in encouraging job creation, economic growth, but also perhaps coming up with additional ideas about how to integrate refugees, displaced into, and actually allowing these individuals, if we stop seeing them as masses, allowing these individuals to also reach their own potential. I'll stop right here.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants in this panel for their insightful comments, as well as also they shed light on certain dimensions that are complementary to the work we're doing and will help definitely the team working both at country level as well as also on the analytical level to take from your experiences, from the comments you made, a lot of insights going forward. Yes, it's a challenging task, and when you hear the experts here around the table or around on the panel, you see that it's challenging. But it's an interesting task. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't be sitting here working together in order to make it happen. Of course, it is not going to be an easy one, but it's going to be an exciting one. What I would like to say, I don't know, Faisal, do we still have some 5 minutes if we want to ask questions from the audience before maybe concluding? Yes, let me ask a few questions from the audience. I have a few questions. I have many hands. Let me start with Fawzi, who raised his hand first, and then Abu Mushari. Fawzi. Fawzi, صوتك please positive.
Part of my business to travel the MENA region on a weekly basis, almost. There's one probably missing in the presentation, that's empowerment. The whole presentation in all of the panelists, not a single word relating to empowerment. How to go about empowering your people to work. There was an article, which is a distressing article in New York Times 2 days ago, about one of the Gulf countries trying to nationalize by nationalizing the people, by nationalizing their jobs, they are finding extremely worse challenge by not finding local people to take over those jobs. So the issue of empowering people, vocational schools, plumbers, carpenters, welders, that's something, this is hardcore stuff that's really missing. And I think this is something maybe need to be emphasized.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Abu Shari. Abu Shari came second.
Okay. Hello.
Yes.
أول شيء يعني شكرا جزيلا على التقرير اللي قدمتوه من الIMF، وأنا الحقيقة أطلع إني أحصل على نسخة منها. بس إحنا كل دولنا سواء دول مصدر نفط أو مستورد عندنا شحنة كبيرة من التقارير ومن الدراسات إحنا ما ينقصنا دائما هو اتخاذ القرار في تنفيذ هذه الدراسة. دراسات عملت كثير، وأنا كنت وزير مالية بالكويت وكانت تعمل في أيامها. ناتي نتخذ القرار، حتى لما نتخذ القرار يمكن ما ينفذ في العملية هذه. قرار قليل، قرار صامت. كل هذه القرارات اللي انت تتخذها حتكون قرارات غير شعبية أكيد، بس إذا أنا بطلع ويعذرني زميلنا من الأردن اتخذ قرار في الأردن في شهر رمضان بزيادة أسعار بعض المنتجات النفطية أعتقد الضريبية لمقابلة العجز في الميزانية. طلع الشارع على طول، تخلت الحكومة ودول الخليج جابوا أسبرين يعطون الأردن عشان فترة معينة 3 4 5 سنوات وترجع المشكلة نفس الشكل العملية. احنا في دول الخليج لما لمست أسعار النفط 30 و35 دولار حبينا كلنا نعمل برامج إصلاحية ونخطط وبعد أتكلم عن الكويت، ويا ريت ان رئيس مجلس الامه والاخوان الاعضاء اللي كانوا قبل شويه موجودين يسمعون كلامي في العمليه. بعد ذلك زدنا اسعار النفط بالكويت، اسعار الغاز قصدي، رجعوا بعد 2 3 البرلمان مكسها. ليش؟ لانه وصل سعر البرميل 70 دولار الان. فاحنا يعني اعذرني في هذه القضيه يا اخي، احنا مع كل انا بالعكس انا طلعنا ننظر لتقاريركم، بس احنا نريد ناس تتخذ قرار وتسند هذا القرار. كل القرارات هذه اكيد غير شعبيه، بس لازم انا اوعي الشعب بان هذا القرار اذا ما راح اتخذه اليوم حيكون اصعب بعد 10 سنوات في هذا الخصوص. وانا حيقودني الى سؤال واحد لكم انتم في الIMF. انتم عملتوا برامج اكيد كثيره من كثير الدول العربيه، وانا ما راح اقول لك من الثمانينات التسعينيات، انا بتكلم عن 10 سنوات. كم دولة عربية وقعت معاكم وكم دولة نفذت البرنامج كامل؟ واسف على الإطالة والشكر.
Wafa, can you repeat what Abu Mashari said?
أنا صراحة أمين أيوب نائب رئيس الترجمة الصناعية جبل عامل. أنا my speech will be addressed in Arabic because it's closer to my heart. بدي بس أقول أنا بس تسولت مش أكثر. أنا كان لي شرف عمل مع معاليك مع معالي الدكتور ناصر كوزير صناعة وكوزير مالية، وسبق قلت أنا بعد من السبيل. أنا في عندي شغلة وحدة بثني على الكلام اللي قاله معالي الوزير الكويتي، لأن أنا كنت هقوله إنه أنا جيت على لبنان من 25 سنة وأنا بعمل تقارير وبقدمها للجهات اللي جمعية الصناعيين وزارة الصناعة، والتقارير هذه كنت اترجاهم يقولوا لي يا اخوان انتم بتاخذوا التقارير والدراسات اللي بيصرف عليها وقت كبير بس ما بيجيني فيدباك شو صار، ما حدا بيقول لي وحده. بس نحن صراحه نعاني في مجتمعنا العربي صراحه يا اخوان. اليوم رح ياخذ دور اخوة شناي، كلنا اللبنانيين بنعرفوا مين هو اخوة شناي، انا هاخذ دور اخوة شناي. واصعب شيء انت لما بدك تشخص مرض ظاهر العيان، شغله بسيطه قدام عينك بتروح انت ديب انسايد بدك تفتش شو هو المرض. مرضنا كثير بسيط، وعلاجنا بسيط جدا. عندما نرى الرئيس العربي أو الزعيم العربي يقوم عن كرسيه طوعا فنحن بألف خير. شفتوا كل شيء مرة رئيس عربي أو زعيم عربي قام عن كرسيه طوعا؟ هي وحدة. الشغلة الثانية، نحن بدنا نصلح الأجيال تبعنا. أجيالنا الجيل 30 سنة، نحن بدنا 3-4 أجيال. 3-4 أجيال لنصلح جيلنا العربي، شبابنا، أولادنا وأحفادنا. فنحن بدنا 3 أجيال، يعني بدنا أكثر من 100 سنة من اللحظة اللي نبدأ فيها. للأسف لما نبدأ بعد. شكرا كثير.
Yes. Some brief comments actually. I'm Khaled Hanafi, former minister in Egypt and now the Secretary General of the Union of Arab Chambers, so representing the government and now private sector. The points are, number one, regarding the labor market. I believe in some cases we misunderstand the problem of unemployment because we see unemployment as if it's an open unemployment. While there is a great mismatching between supply and demand in the labor market. So when we gather this with the fourth industrial revolution and the technology, so we need to create a sort of platform, virtual platform, to make a sort of link between the demand and supply of labor. And I believe in many cases in the developing countries, in the Arab countries, that there is an excess supply and excess demand at the same country. This is number one. Number two, when it comes to the presentation of growth and trade, yes, in many cases we have trade agreements and we open the door. But one of the major problems here is the non-tariff barriers, specifically when it comes to the supply chain problems and logistics. So we need to solving the problem through the technology, again, the artificial intelligence, the IoT, and so on. And there are great solutions that we can find over here. Number three, regarding the finance and the fiscal policy, in many of the cases, we challenge the growth while we shrink the component of the government expenditure in the equation. So governments, when they hear from the IMF and some international organizations that we need to rationalize, the residual will be the government expenditure, so there is no way to get the growth. In Egypt, finally, and here I'm sitting, the honor sitting to the ex-Prime Minister of Egypt, that we had some great experience in solving some problems regarding the subsidy in Egypt, and we reached some financial inclusion. In 1 year, we included 50,000 outlets in the banking system, and we get rationalized the system with more than 70 million Egyptians. Thank you.
شكرا معالي الوزير. Martin, you want to say something? آخر شخص هو
You mentioned the confidence gap between the governments and the business community. From your perspective, from your experience in the public sector, what would be the top 2-3 things governments should do in general, or let's say in the case of Jordan? Thank you.
Okay, one word final for each of the speakers. The question is to you, and then come back.
Actually, I don't think that we need to over-exaggerate the fact that our economies are very well served. Indeed, we very much still lack an informed decision-making process in the region. At least in my experience, a lot of sometimes arbitrary decisions, a lot of regulations being introduced. So our economies became at some point really heavily over-regulated because of this lack of specific and very precise knowledge about what to do. On building the gap, which I think most of the issues that I've had actually somehow related to that, either on the investment private sector side or in the making, governments needs to stick to whatever program they adopt, whether it's an IMF program, whether it's a national vision. The more you stick to the vision that you're working on, the more credible you become in terms of. Second, you better communicate this policy. You need really to communicate it and to be open and transparent about it. And my colleague from His Excellency from Kuwait, he said that it's unpopular by nature, these decisions that we're taking. So don't expect sort of a massive support to go and behind this. Indeed, it's to the contrary. Do you want stability in the long run, or do you need sort of short-term political gain? This is the compromise that any sort of prime minister or minister would make. Either I would go with political capital, and people will talk positively about probably some of my ministers, or I will put my political capital on the table in order to achieve long-term sort of kind of stability. I know that we're short of time.
Yes. Maha, you want to say something?
Just, I would say that the crisis of confidence is not just between the private sector and governments, but it's actually between citizens and their governments. And in order to be able to address that, there are many measures that need to be taken, including a separation of powers, accountability measures, and a lot more. One can talk about these at length. The other part of the question is participation, the capacity, I mean, preserving fundamental freedoms and allowing people to engage and participate in decision-making processes. هذول مش نظريات.
I think confidence is something that we need to think of, to work on. Kat?
Maybe just on the issue of vocational training, we talk a bit about it in the report, and there's a lot that can be done on government's active labour market policies. To give you one stat there, only a third of those courses are resulting in people with better employment or earning opportunities, and I think there's a huge potential there in terms of reform to help address some of the skills gaps that we're seeing in the markets and to prepare people for work. Thank you.
Dr. Saidi, the last word is to you.
Thank you. There are a couple of comments that were made about empowerment, and I think the bottom line, there are two things. What is clear is that we need to build capacity within our governments, within our ministries. The capacity is not there. I've been through countless vision documents. Every single country nearly in our region has a vision document of 2025, 2030, 2035. But when you go into the governments and you see the capacity to implement, the capacity to implement is simply not there. So one of the major areas is to improve the capacity of our governments, our ministries and other agencies. But the second, and this was mentioned just now, is the question of accountability and participation. We don't do any policy impact analysis, and we are afraid nobody has the political courage to say, I have a problem and I want to face it, and it's going to be hard. Listen to what we heard this morning from the head of parliament from Kuwait. He was the most applauded this morning. Why was he the most applauded? Because he said things that we don't usually hear from our politicians, namely, be brave, face up to your problems, and do something about it. So I think you need much more political capital, much more political courage, I would say. And I'll just give you an example. There's a fellow called Nelson Mandela, Allah yarhamu, spent 26